February 24th, 2026, the President of the United States stood before a joint session of Congress and said the following: "Our border is secure. Our spirit is restored. Inflation is plummeting. Incomes are rising fast. The roaring economy is roaring like never before, and our enemies are scared." The roaring economy is roaring like never before. 8 days later, the Bureau of Labor Statistics published the February employment report. The economy lost 92,000 jobs, against an expectation of a gain of 50,000. In the same week that a Supreme Court ruling stripped the legal foundation from his entire trade policy, and 3 weeks into a war that pushed oil prices to their highest level since the summer of 2022. Think about what that means. The speech did not happen before the data was bad. It happened on the same day the data broke. The gap between the official story and the structural reality was not hours or days. It was simultaneous. The president was standing at the podium declaring a roaring economy, while outside the building, 6 mechanisms were already in motion that told a completely different story. And that gap between the narrative and the numbers is not a communications problem that better speechwriting can close. It is a structural problem, and structural problems have structural consequences. In November, every American voter will have a chance to file their audit report. Before we go further, subscribe to this channel if you have not already, and tell me in the comments, does the economy feel like it is roaring to you? Is less than #0. 1 hash is greater than drop your answer below. I read every single one. The numbers in this video come from institutional sources: the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the Federal Reserve's own FOMC minutes. The data is not contested. What it means together, that is what this video is about. Now let me take you through 6 layers. Not 6 talking points. 6 separate mechanisms that are all moving in the same direction at the same time. By the end, you will not need to choose between the president's version and the opposition's version. The data makes the choice for you. A note on methodology before we begin. A financial analyst who works purely with policy indicators once described this kind of moment to me as the equivalent of reading a ship's navigation log that says, "Course steady. Full speed ahead while the sonar is already pinging rocks." The log is technically accurate. The captain believes what he wrote. The sonar just does not care. That is the mechanical precision of the situation we are in right now. That is the structural picture. Here is each mechanism. Layer 1, the labor market, March 6th, 2026. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the United States economy lost 92,000 non-farm payroll jobs in February. The expectation was a gain of 50,000. That is a miss of 142,000 jobs in a single month. Do the math. That is a miss larger than the entire monthly job gain in the weakest quarter of the pandemic recovery. But the headline number is not the most important figure. The most important figure is the 3-month moving average. When you smooth out the February number against January and a sharply revised December, December was revised down from a gain of 48,000 to a loss of 17,000, the 3-month average for job. Creation now stands at fewer than 6,000 per month. That is not a number that needs context. That is a number that speaks for itself. 6,000 jobs per month. That is the 3-month average. The United States economy needs to add roughly 100,000 per month just to absorb new entrants to the labor force. At 6,000, it is not keeping pace with population growth. It is falling behind. Let that sit for a second. The unemployment rate rose to 4.4%. The average duration of unemployment reached 25.7 weeks, the longest since December 2021. And the household survey, which produces the headline unemployment rate, showed that the number of employed Americans has declined by nearly 850,000 since November. Read that again, 850,000 fewer employed Americans since November. The headline rate moved only modestly because approximately 1.2 million people also left the labor force entirely. If labor force participation had held steady at its November level, the headline unemployment rate would have already cleared 5%. Do the math. That is not the economy roaring. That is the economy losing altitude on instruments. The official altitude meter is not reading correctly. So here's where we actually are after layer 1. Job creation has essentially stalled. The 3-month average is near 0. Nearly 1 million people have exited the labor force in 3 months. And the headline unemployment rate is being held down by the fact that workers are stopping their search, not by workers finding jobs. That is layer 1. Now for layer 2. Layer 2. The growth number. The Bureau of Economic Analysis published its advance estimate for fourth quarter GDP on February 20th. Fourth quarter growth came in at 1.4% annualized. The prior quarter had grown at 4.4%. Economists surveyed before the release expected roughly 2.8%. The actual number was 1.4. That is a decline of 3 full percentage points in 1 quarter, in a single economic reporting period. The BEA analysis attributed approximately 1 full percentage point of the shortfall to the government spending drag created by the October-November government shutdown, the longest in modern American history. Federal government expenditures fell by 17% annualized in the quarter, a self-inflicted wound that subtracted 1 point directly from headline growth. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, full-year economic growth in 2025 was 2.2% lower than the 2.8% recorded in 2024. The administration that declared a roaring economy presided over a GDP growth rate that, by BEA's own numbers, decelerated in every comparable reporting period. That is Layer 2. Let that sit for a second. Layer 3, the tariff architecture. On February 20th, 2026, the same day the GDP report was published, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled, 6-3, that the tariffs the president had imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act were unlawful. Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority, was precise. The statute does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. Congress holds that power. The president does not. The IEEPA tariffs had, by the time of the ruling, collected an estimated $175 to $179 billion in duties from American importers. The Tax Foundation estimated these tariffs added approximately $1,000 to the average American household's costs in 2025, and as much as $1,300 in 2026. Nearly 90% of those tariff costs were borne by American firms and consumers, not by foreign exporters. That finding is documented in Federal Reserve Bank of New York research. The president responded within hours. A new tariff authority, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, was invoked to impose a 15% global surcharge. But Section 122 carries legal constraints that IEPA did not. The authority is capped at 15%. It expires in 150 days around July 24, 2026. New investigations under Section 301 are underway to construct longer-term tariff authority. But those require time, findings of fact, and are subject to their own litigation risk. The effective United States tariff rate climbed to nearly 17%, the highest level since the early 1930s. The administration called this a pillar of economic strength. The Supreme Court ruled it exceeded presidential authority. Those two facts cannot coexist in the same economic narrative. So here is what 3 layers of the breakdown look like together. Jobs are not growing. GDP decelerated. And the signature trade policy just lost its legal foundation and is being rebuilt on a statute with a countdown clock. 3 of the 6 mechanisms are already in motion. The next 3 are the ones that hit households directly. If this analysis is giving you a framework the mainstream coverage did not, the subscribe button keeps it coming. This channel covers the mechanics behind the headlines. Layer 4, the oil shock, March 9th, 2026 today. Oil prices briefly reached nearly $120 per barrel, their highest level since the summer of 2022. The catalyst is the Iran conflict. Iran's decision to close the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply passes daily, has produced a supply shock that economists classify as a first-order global event. That is not a routine commodity move. That is a supply shock repricing. Asian markets responded immediately. Japan's Nikkei 225 closed down 5.2%. South Korea's Kospi fell 6%, triggering circuit breakers for the second consecutive session. Japan sources roughly 90% of its crude from the Middle East, South Korea approximately 70%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell more than 700 points in early trading Monday. Here is what the oil shock means for the domestic story. A sustained oil price at or above $100 adds directly to consumer price inflation. Fuel costs, transportation costs, and input costs across manufacturing, food distribution, and services all move with oil. That is the inflation leg. And higher inflation gives the Federal Reserve additional reason not to cut rates, which leads directly to Layer 6. But first, Layer 5. Here is the simple version of where we are halfway through. Jobs are not growing. GDP decelerated sharply in the 4th quarter. The tariff program lost its legal foundation and is now being rebuilt on a different statute with a 150-day clock, and a major oil shock arrived this morning. 4 of the 6 mechanisms are now visible. The next 2 are the ones that explain why this becomes political. Layer 5, the 2 economies. Here is where the roaring economy narrative breaks apart at its foundation. According to the minutes of the Federal Open Market Committee meeting of January 27th and 28th, 2026, published by the Federal Reserve itself, committee members documented what they described as a disparity between strong sales to higher income consumers and soft sales to lower income consumers. That phrase did not come from a political opponent or an advocacy group. It came from the Federal Reserve's own internal record of deliberations. The institution that sets American monetary policy formally acknowledged in writing that the economy Americans are experiencing depends almost entirely on which America you are asking about. The data corroborates this. An AP NORC poll conducted in early February found that 39% of American adults approved of the president's handling of the economy. Consumer confidence surveys documented a similar deterioration, a 15-month slide of more than 21 index points from the November 2024 peak. Think about what that actually means for the average household. After-tax incomes adjusted for inflation grew by just 0.9% in 2025. That is the smallest annual gain since 2022, when inflation was at a 40-year high. Wages and salary growth has slowed as the hiring rate collapsed. Real purchasing power, what your paycheck actually buys at the grocery store, and the gas pump has essentially moved sideways for most of the past year. The split is not between optimists and pessimists. The split is structural. Roughly half of American households own no equities at all, no retirement account with market exposure, no brokerage account, nothing. For them, a Dow at 50,000 is not a data point about their life. A $600 monthly grocery bill and a 25-week average job searches. That is the economy they are living in. And that is the economy the Federal Reserve's own minutes just confirmed is the one most Americans inhabit. Think about what that actually means for the political story. The administration's economic narrative is built largely on stock market performance and headline unemployment. Both metrics are real. But both metrics are most visible to the households that already hold assets. For a household in the bottom 60% of wealth distribution, which, by Federal Reserve data, owns less than 6% of total corporate equities, the S&P 500 is background noise. What is not background noise is the cost of groceries, the cost of fuel, the cost of carrying a 6.9% mortgage that cannot be refinanced because the Fed has been paused for months. The narrative and the mechanism are targeting two different populations. That is not a miscommunication. That is a structural misalignment between the story being told and the economy most households are actually living. Now you might be thinking, the economy added jobs for years before this one bad month does not define a trend. And you would be right if it were one bad month. But the 3-month average of fewer than 6,000 shows the deterioration began before February. And consumer confidence data shows that consumers felt it before the BLS confirmed it. The data is not a surprise. It is a confirmation of what households were already experiencing. Layer 6, the Federal Reserve trap. The Federal Reserve held rates steady at 3.5% to 3.75% at the January meeting. It has been paused since the December cut. The oil shock now arriving introduces two simultaneous and incompatible pressures. Persistent oil above $100 raises consumer inflation expectations, which argues for rates staying higher for longer. The jobs data, the GDP deceleration, and the labor market deterioration argue for cuts. You cannot satisfy both arguments with a single rate decision. That is the definition of a policy trap. Following the jobs report, traders repriced expectations, pulling the anticipated first cut toward July or later. And this management problem arrives precisely as leadership transitions. Jerome Powell's term expires May 15th, 2026. A Trump-appointed successor will be navigating the Fed's most complex inflation-employment trade-off in years, with their first major decisions potentially coming in the middle of a war-driven oil shock. Markets historically price in uncertainty around Fed leadership transitions. This one arrives at the intersection of a supply-side inflation shock, a weakening labor market, and a legally disrupted trade architecture. The word for the combination is stagflation. The Fed's standard toolkit is not designed for it. Cutting rates into inflation feeds the price problem. Holding rates into a collapsing labor market deepens the employment problem. Either path has a cost. If this breakdown is shifting how you read the economic picture right now, hit the like button. And leave a comment. Do you think the Fed cuts before November, or does stagflation risk make that impossible? Drop it below. Now let me close the distance between what just happened at the institutional level and what it means at the personal level. Take a registered nurse in Ohio earning $68,000 a year. In 2024, her real after-tax income grew by roughly 2%. In 2025, the Tax Foundation estimates that tariff-related price increases added approximately $1,000 to her household costs. Her after-tax real income growth slowed to under 1% for the year, the smallest gain since the inflation peak of 2022. Her mortgage is locked in at 6.9%. She has not refinanced because the Fed's pause has kept rates elevated. Her hospital system reduced overtime as staffing was reallocated. The arithmetic: $1,000 in additional tariff costs, reduced overtime income, and zero real income growth in a year, the official narrative called a roaring economy. The tariff is not a geopolitical abstraction. It is a line item in her household budget. And the Federal Reserve's decision not to cut rates is not a monetary policy concept. It is the reason her refinancing did not happen and will not happen before the November ballot. My role here is analyst, not advisor. I cannot tell you what to do with your money. What I can tell you is what the data from the BEA, the Tax Foundation, and the Federal Reserve shows and where the structural pressure is building. Here is what to watch in the weeks ahead. First, the March Employment Situation Report, due April 3rd. If the 3-month average remains below 20,000 jobs, the case for a structural labor market deterioration becomes very difficult to dismiss with one-off explanations. Second, the February Consumer Price Index, due March 11th. It will not yet capture the oil shock, but core services and shelter inflation will reveal whether price pressure was retreating before the shock arrived. Third, the Section 122 tariff clock, which expires around July 24th, what replaces it and under what legal authority, is the next constitutional test for the administration's trade agenda. Fourth, the Federal Reserve statement at the March 18th and 19th meeting, which will signal how seriously the committee is weighing the stagflation scenario. These 4 data points, read together over the next 6 weeks, will tell you more about the November environment than any speech will. Specifically, if the March jobs number is another miss, the administration faces a 3-month consecutive deterioration in the most watched economic indicator ahead of the midterms. If the CPI shows oil shock inflation beginning to embed, the Fed's window for cuts before November narrows further. If the Section 122 authority faces its own legal challenge before the July clock expires, the administration enters the summer without a functioning trade architecture for the 3rd time in 12 months. Each of these is a separate variable. All 3 moving in the same direction simultaneously is a structural scenario, not a cyclical blip. Step back for a second. Before we go to the structural conclusion, here is the plain version of what we have established. 6 mechanisms. Job stalling, GDP decelerating, the tariff program voided by the Supreme Court and rebuilt on a statute with a 150-day expiration, an oil shock arriving in real time, today, March 9th. The Federal Reserve trapped between fighting inflation and cutting for jobs, and a consumer economy splitting in 2, confirmed in the Fed's own words, based entirely on whether you own assets or not. These are not talking points. They are the institutional record, and they all move in the same direction. Now, for the historical calibration, because this pattern has appeared before, and the mechanism is not new, consider what happened in the United States in 1979 and 1980. The Carter administration entered 1979 with official confidence in the economic trajectory. In January of that year, the official messaging held that the economy had stabilized after the shocks of the early decade. Then in the spring of 1979, the Iranian Revolution disrupted oil production, and the second oil shock of the decade sent crude prices surging again. Iran, again. The same geography, the same choke point. In Washington, the prevailing view in the administration was that the shock was manageable. In kitchen tables across Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, the view was different. Consumer prices rose over 13% in 1979. Gasoline lines stretched around city blocks. The Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker beginning in August of that year, was forced into the most aggressive rate tightening in modern American history. Unemployment climbed above 7% heading into the 1980 election. The administration's approval rating on economic handling had fallen below 40%. In November 1980, the incumbent lost the White House in one of the largest electoral reversals in post-war American history. Read that sequence again in the context of today. The names change. The arithmetic does not. An oil shock that feeds inflation. A central bank caught between competing pressures. A labor market weakening while the official narrative insists on strength. And an approval rating on economic handling below 40%. That was 1979 and 1980. The economic approval rating today stands at 39%. Job creation is at 6,000 per month. The Federal Reserve's own minutes document the consumer economy splitting. The tariff rate is at its highest since the early 1930s. The structural condition today is not identical to 1980. The Fed has different tools. The legal constraints on trade policy are different. But the core dynamic, a supply-side shock compressing household budgets while official messaging insists on strength, is the same mechanism operating under different labels. And in 1980, the mechanism did not care about the messaging. It cared about the grocery bill. Now for the structural verdict. When a sitting executive enters a midterm campaign with weakening job creation, an oil shock, an approval rating below 40% on the economy, and a legal defeat on his signature domestic policy, the historical record does not promise a specific outcome. It just shows consistent ones. In November, every House seat is on the ballot, 1/3 of the Senate. Every voter who fills out that ballot will carry their grocery bill, their mortgage statement, and their last quarter of job search into the booth. And they will compare it against a speech that said the roaring economy was roaring like never before. That comparison is the audit. The midterms are the report card. And the data has already written the questions. The voters will write the answers. Hit subscribe if this is the kind of analysis you came here for. The like button helps more people find this video before the narrative settles. And leave a comment with the question that matters most to you right now. Is this still recoverable before November, or has the window already closed? The data has a view on that question, and it has not been kind to the roaring economy narrative. One final observation. The institutions cited in this video, the BLS, the BEA, the Federal Reserve, the Supreme Court, are not opposition research. They are the same sources the administration cites when data is favorable. When those same institutions produce unfavorable data, the methodology does not change. The data does not have a political affiliation. It just has a direction.